Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar uh, titled A General Overview on TPO and TPI. I'm very happy to be here today because it's the second time that we, as Sports Talks at Calle Serrano, organize a webinar together with ISDE, Instituto de Derecho y Economía de Madrid, the institution where Andre Gribel and I, who are the founders of Sports Talk at Calle Serrano, have studied and where it all began. It's my pleasure to introduce all of the guests of today's webinar. So I will start with Andre, who is the co-founder of Sports Talk at Calle Serrano, and then we will introduce all the other guests. Hi, Andre.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show of Sports Talks at Calle Serrano and ISDE. Can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes.
So welcome, everyone, to today's show of Sports Talks at Calle Serrano and ISDE. It's a pleasure to be here with my good friend and Sports Talks colleague, Lucio, and for this great subject that we are discussing today with two great speakers. Please, Lucio.
So I will move, giving the floor to Daniel. Hi, Daniel. Welcome to our webinar. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And thanks, Lucio and Andre and Marsha and everyone for joining in and for giving me the invitation alongside Stefano to speak this evening. So it's great to be a part of this evening event.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. And Stefano, what about you? Are you in Madrid, right?
Yes, hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon, buenas tardes to everyone. Thanks a lot to Lucio, to Andre for the very kind invitation to ISDE, the ISDE alumni. And it's a pleasure to be sharing this panel with Daniel. I'm in fact in Madrid. This morning I was at ISDE in person. So like you and Andrea, I'm also a part of the ISDE family. I'm older than you because I was back in ISDE in 2010, and I am a professor. And I have to say that it was really a pleasure being able to be back in person after months, let's say, of virtual interaction.
Thank you, Stefano. So I think we can start. We prepared some question. Andre and I prepared some question for both of you, and we hope we will receive a lot of questions also from our viewers, our followers. I will start with Daniel, and I would like to ask him a general question, and the following, that is, what is a third-party ownership? Which is the general introduction you will do.
No, of course, and more than happy to give a bit of a general introduction. And again, I think as we talked about beforehand in terms of preparation for this event and for this screening as well, that it would be great to have that interaction between everybody as well, and especially for Stefano, please feel free to add and comment and contribute, even if it is not your question, because you are equally as experienced and knowledgeable about these areas, if not more so. So I would welcome your input as well for that. But I think if I can give the answer, which will maybe open up more questions in different ways, which was a great question, Lucio, to start off, is that I think if we talk about third-party ownership, third-party investment, as the initial slide talks about, I think it's probably fair to say that there are numerous models for, I like to call it third-party investment, is the truth. And I know one of the questions we're going to be talking about is whether there is that much of a difference. Query, I'm not necessarily so sure on that, but we can get into that in some detail. If we're talking about the different models for TPI agreements, the basic premise was that a company, a business, an individual provided football clubs or players with money in return for owning a percentage of a player's future transfer value. And this transfer value was commonly referred to as a player's economic rights. And previously, without going into again too much detail at this initial stage, before regulators in particular countries like England, with the Football Association, through the Premier League, through the FA, through FIFA, obviously in 2015, I believe too, plenty of companies prior to that time, before the regulatory frameworks were updated to account for these types of models and these types of agreements, plenty of companies acted as effective speculators, whereby they'd be purchasing a percentage share in a player directly from the club in return for a lump sum that the club could use as it wished. And companies would also provide financial support for young up-and-coming players as well. And that support may have originally taken the form of meeting housing costs, making monthly payments to the player and his family, paying for training, traveling, school expenses. There was very much that need to be able to invest and then in return get a future particular percentage. And what would effectively happen, as mentioned, in return is that the player would agree that the investor would be entitled to a percentage of any future transfer fee when the player signed a professional contract with a football club. Now, we'll go into, again, detail is that those type of agreements have now been banned under the FIFA regulations. And the issue now, even though it's a few years old now, is what has happened since, how has the market adapted, what has happened that has effectively made it industry standard to be able to do things in particular ways, and where does the industry go from here?
Thank you, Daniel. And while on the same question, if you could bring some cases to light, as they might give a better picture to the followers of situations, specifically in England, that raised the discussion regarding TPO or TPI.
Yeah, so if it's okay, I think what I would like to just provide a story on is where a lot of this came to the forefront. I mentioned it in my book Done Deal as Tevez Gate, but effectively it was the situation where two South American players, Carlos Tevez and Javier Mascherano, transferred from their club Corinthians, a Brazilian club, to West Ham United, and that effectively happened right at the end of the transfer window in 2006. And at the time, West Ham weren't one of the biggest teams in the Premier League, far from it. And what effectively happened was these two world star players transferred to West Ham for what people believed was probably significant sums. Now, the complication that occurred, or that the Premier League found out at a later time, was that the economic rights of Tevez and Mascherano were not owned by West Ham, the club, but actually by two different companies. One was, I think, MSI, and another company who were owned by third-party entities that had effectively, prior to the move from Corinthians to West Ham, bought the economic rights and come effectively to an agreement with West Ham that there was effectively a veto right, that those companies had the power to force West Ham to accept transfer bids from other clubs for those players. Now, at the time, West Ham submitted the player contracts to the Premier League, but not the TPI agreements, which gave the TPI companies the transfer control over them, where the club obviously didn't have. Now, what effectively happened, I believe then a few months later, was that there was then a takeover by West Ham. And in 2007, a few months after the initial transfer had happened, the new owners of the club disclosed the TPI agreements to the Premier League. And at that point, the Premier League then opened a disciplinary commission or rather decided to refer the matter to a disciplinary commission. And less than a year after the initial transfers, I believe in around April 2007, then the disciplinary commission ruled quite controversially that instead of a points deduction, because effectively there was a breach of the Premier League regulations, because another entity could have control and influence over the transfer policies and employment policies of the club, the commission effectively fined West Ham £5.5 million and required that the club terminate the TPI agreements in short order. That they purported to do so. I'm sorry, I'm giving the long answer to this, but they purported to do so. But effectively, then, as everybody knows, which is quite controversial, what happened is in the last game of the season, where West Ham needed to win away at Manchester United, obviously one of the top clubs in Europe at the time, they won the game, but only through a Carlos Tevez goal. So he materially impacted on the result, which kept West Ham up, relegated Sheffield United, which again was controversial. And then there was a subsequent case between Sheffield United and West Ham, which in the end was settled, where West Ham had to pay several millions of pounds to West Ham as compensation for all of those particular breaches. So that's the short way of saying the case. But again, the story doesn't end there, because effectively Carlos Tevez moves on to Manchester United on effectively a 2-year loan deal or equivalent. Javier Mascherano moves for a significant sum to Liverpool. So Liverpool pay the third-party owners a significant amount of money. And then when Tevez's third-party owners can't agree a transfer fee, goes to Manchester City, their arch rivals, and obviously does very well there. So it's a story of third-party investment, millions of pounds, and transfers and rivalries.
Yes, it's a good picture of the situation, with all of the drama and intrigue that feels a good novel. So it's a good picture. And I would like to know, as you mentioned before, TPO, third-party ownership, and third-party investment would be blurrily mixed. I would like to learn from you if you would take some differences between them, or would they be the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd be really keen on Stefano's views on this as well. If I just maybe mention very briefly, but again, I'm keen on hearing Stefano, because I've already talked for too long already about this topic without other people having the chance to. But you know, my view is that what I feel tended to happen in years gone by is that the stakeholders that believed that there were distinct advantages to these type of ownership structures would call it TPI investment, TPI third-party investment, and those that considered it to have quite negative externalities, negative results, would call it third-party ownership. And in a way, that is what the labeling in a way of these type of concepts were, is that somehow ownership of a football player is so abhorrent and so immoral that it should be ended straight away, rather than third-party investment, which is more of a clinical investment return which benefits all of the parties. So I wondered sometimes whether, and Stefano, be welcome for your thoughts, of whether sometimes it is that way, not necessarily because there is a large difference, maybe you'd say that differently, but actually because of the label and emotive nature that is attached to the different sayings.
Okay. Thank you. We were very, very clear. Thank you for answering to that important question. And now I have another question for you, which consists of the difference between the Article 18 bis and the Article 18 ter of FIFA RSTP. What do these articles say, and which is the main difference?
Okay, I'm going to try and multitask here, because what I'm going to do is get my my website, my web screen available, we don't need to share it, but just so I can read from the RTSP as well, to be able to look through the FIFA regulations as well. So the FIFA regulations effectively have, originally at least, before 2015, I believe, had 18 bis, which specifically related to third-party influence on clubs. Now, at the time, because third-party investment / ownership was not necessarily old, and i.e. was an accepted practice to a degree, and because it was just coming into the market to an extent, there was no specific wording around the actual practice of TPI. But what a lot of cases involved with, including the Tevez case originally, because those same types of provisions were included in the Premier League regulations, was the prohibition on third-party influence of clubs. And in that case, what we were talking about is specifically in the RSTP, the FIFA RSTP, is Article 18 bis, which says no club, and I'll just read it, no club shall enter into a contract which enables, and I'll just paraphrase, any third party to acquire the ability to influence in employment or transfer related matters, its independence, its policies, or the performance of its teams. So that was the general catch-all provision originally, which FIFA and their national associations would use to effectively ensure that no third party could effectively influence the day-to-day runnings of a football club. And where that provision caught TPI agreements was if there was some type of direct or indirect control which enabled the third party to control when a club accepted, rejected, didn't transfer a player accordingly. Now, where that worked initially was that third-party agreements would say, you're absolutely fine if there was a third-party agreement between the third-party investor and the club, the third-party investor would say, we think that the club should sell for an amount over £10 million, which would guarantee the investor a particular return. But we're not going to insist on the club doing that. But in order to protect our investment, what we do insist is that if you, the club, reject it, you have to pay us a fee of X amount in order to protect our position and our capital back with interest within a particular period of time. So obviously it wasn't a direct obligation, but it was an indirect penalty that if the club did not accept the transfer term of the buying club, then there would be an amount of money to pay. So that was a way indirectly of affecting the transfer related matters of the club's autonomy and or independence. Now, very briefly then scrolling on to 18 TER, where this regulation was specifically brought in to prohibit third-party ownership of players' rights. And if I just mention 18 TER 1, because that is effectively the prohibition, and that states that no club or player shall enter into an agreement with a third party. And I query that bit third party because Stefano is going to give some really interesting insights on the definition of third party soon, whereby a third party is being entitled to participate either in full or in part in compensation payable in relation to a future transfer of a player from one club to another, or is being assigned any rights in relation to a future transfer or transfer compensation. So here we are having explicit reference to the particular third-party ownership / third-party investment model that had previously been in place that was now effectively being prohibited.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And before we go to Stefano, and you touched upon third party, which Stefano will talk about it as well. I would like to get your thoughts on why FIFA decided not to consider the player anymore a third party.
Well, it's a great point, because this has probably been quite a bone of contention since the regulations came in, since 18TR came into force, because again, that first particular section, if I just read that again very briefly, is no club or player shall enter into an agreement with a third party. And third party in the RSTP is defined as a party other than the two clubs transferring a player from one to the other. So therefore, under the previous RSTP regulations, a player would be effectively defined as a third party, i.e. they would be prohibited from having a future stake in their transfer rights. Now, the reason why this changed, my understanding is, at least as well, is because of a number of cases, including Werder Bremen, Greek club Panathinaikos, and a Chilean club Colo Colo, where effectively what happened is there were rulings which effectively considered whether players would be considered a third party with respect to their own transfers. And based on those decisions, it was deemed that a player could not be considered a third party with respect to its own transfers, and therefore it would not be considered a violation of FIFA's rules on third-party ownership of players' economic rights for a player to own effectively a percentage of their own transfer fees, which meant that then I think it was obviously the FIFA Congress, to change the rules, had to adjust the concept of a third party by issuing a new version back in June 19, so that there was a clarification as to the fact that a third party is a party, again, let's make reference, a party other than the player being transferred. So effectively it meant that players could own, under the FIFA regulations and new definitions, could own a future stake in their transfer rights.
Thank you, Daniel. And now, giving the floor to Stefano, I would like to ask him a specific question. And I think it's an interesting question, because we talk about third-party ownership, third-party investment. We talk about the articles of FIFA RSTP, which prohibit, which ban this kind of TPO and TPI. But in your opinion, Stefano, which is like the real reason according to which in 2015 FIFA decided to ban explicitly TPO?
Well, thanks a lot, Lucio. I would say that, and also thanks to Daniel for the mentions in his answers. And I think that Daniel already, in his answers, he already essentially outlined some of the reasons why FIFA was initially concerned and then decided to ban the practice. And that ends up relating to a number of high-profile cases, such starting from Tevez and Mascherano in 2009, but then there were a number of cases where third parties were started to be seen as influencing unduly the relationship between clubs and players. It would seem very, very strange, you know, that a traditional important clubs such as West Ham, for example, would participate to the Premier League and even avoid relegation thanks to the participation of two football players, which effectively did not own and were owned but by some non-better specified investor. And then on that year, on 2009, what FIFA decided to do was to ban third-party influence. So it introduced Article 18 bis, mirroring the regulations that already existed in the FA. But in the following years, so starting from 2009, this effectively didn't stop, let's say, some opicious, non-transparent deals where also with unclear origin of the money. And then in those 4 or 5 years between 2009 and 2014, there were a lot of discussions on whether the practice should be regulated or prohibited. And the reasons were, as said, those which Daniel already made reference to. So the risk for the club independency, the obscure origin of the money, the risk for the integrity of the competitions, and even some, let's say, populistic reasons, let's say, such as the fact that the players would be exploited or would be sort of some slaves because of the ownership. And here I also touch upon another point that Daniel mentioned is the wording TPO, so third-party ownership, which was not the original name, let's say, of the practice, a practice that originated in South America and where it was never defined as propriedad or property or ownership, because as Daniel said, no right of ownership can exist towards football players. And there, the names used in Portuguese and Spanish were derechos económicos or direitos económicos. And then, let's say the fact of calling this TPO instead of TPI, so third-party investment, or TPE, third-party entitlement, was also another name given by those in favor, also shed a sort of negative light on the practice. But I think that is very interesting, Lucio, to focus not only on the reasons why it was banned, because in some way we know them, but I would like to focus, since some years passed, on how it was banned, because now we know that it was banned by FIFA, and now some years passed, and now that the debate has already in some way started, we are 6 years far from that decision. And I think it is interesting to analyze that decision again, because it was a decision taken by the FIFA Executive Committee on the 18th December 2014, and that followed two studies mandated by FIFA, one to the CIES and one to the CDES in 2013. But none of the studies which were mandated by FIFA was, in a way, conclusive in respect of the fact that TPO should, in fact, be banned. So we have these two studies which were mandated in 2013 to two respected institutions, and the conclusions were not in favor of prohibition, but rather on the fact that further economic analysis of the implications would be needed. And then there was another study which was commissioned by the European Club Association, so the ECA. You know that ECA has also some member clubs which were heavily relying on TPO, such as the Portuguese club and the Spanish clubs. And thus the ECA commissioned an independent study by KPMG called Project TPO Report. And also there, the conclusion was not clearly in favor of a complete ban of TPO. And then there was a meeting, so FIFA created a working group, such as always happens when they are working in the possible amendment of regulations. And given that the topic was quite sensitive, they created a working group with the usual participants, so FIFPro, UEFA, the leagues, CONMEBOL, the associations, and so on. And there was only one meeting, a single meeting of this working group. And given that between the participants, many of the participants, of the stakeholders, were in favor of regulation instead of prohibition, the conclusion of the only meeting held by this working group was that there was no unanimity regarding one specific regulatory approach. So we have two studies mandated by FIFA, which are not conclusive in favor of prohibition, one study committed by ECA with similar results, and then following the only meeting of the working group, then the prohibition comes, already announced by the FIFA Executive Committee. It also caught of surprise some of the people who participated to this meeting, because then you can really question what was the purpose of this meeting. So what I want to say is we are here talking about having banned a practice which has a very significant economic impact back in a time when there were studies regarding its economic impact. It was around 10% of the overall numbers of the transfer market. So we are banning a practice, we are forbidding some investors from participating to this market, and this without a single study which was conclusive. So I'm not saying that there potentially could be a study which would recommend to ban it, but effectively there was not. So I think this is an important factor to keep in mind.
Very good. Thank you, Stefano. And we also have already some questions about that subject from the viewers, but we'll go to them a bit later on. And regarding the third party, the player no longer being considered a third party, can this player afterwards enter into an agreement with his lawyer, a third party, for that end, concerning these economic rights, assigning these economic rights the player received from the clubs regarding his transfer?
So thanks, Andre. That's a very good question. So when you ask me if he can, we have to specify what we mean by he can, because that he can, it's no doubt he can. Materially he can do it, but then legally speaking also the answer to this depends, because if you're asking me from a regulatory perspective, a perspective of the prohibition of Article 18 ter of the FIFA RSTP, the prohibition which Daniel just exposed, where then he cannot. So in the sense that he's also covered by the prohibition, since Article 18 ter says that no club or player shall enter into an agreement with third parties granting any rights. So from the perspective of Article 18 ter of the FIFA RSTP, he cannot, and thus he might be subject to sanctions, even if, at least to date, I'm not aware of any case where a player has been sanctioned contrary to football clubs. There are now a number of decisions from the FIFA disciplinary committee where football clubs have been sanctioned, and so far I'm not aware of any case sanctioning players. But this is a part of the answer, and this is the part of the answer which relates, let's say, to the disciplinary aspect of a player's further assigning the economic rights that he received from a club. From another point of view, this does not mean the fact that he is forbidden from assigning them under the FIFA regulations does not mean that if he materially does it, then the contract of assignment would be null and void under a civil law point of view. So from one side, we have the disciplinary consequences. So if he does it, he might be, for example, subject to disciplinary consequences. But then on the other side, we have the issue of the validity of the contract, and that the answer to that would depend to the applicable law. And it might be, for instance, that the CAS in its ordinary composition or a national court would even find that agreement to be valid.
Cool. So I have another specific question for you, Stefano, and it is related to the agents and to the activity of the agents or the intermediaries. So are allowed agents to receive percentages over the future transfer of the players they assist?
Thank you, Lucio. So the answer, as a matter of fact, the answer to this question is kind of similar to the previous one in the sense that it depends, again. Mm-hmm. Under the FIFA regulations and under the FIFA regulation on working with intermediaries, they are forbidden from doing so by Article 7, Paragraph 4, and that was already a prohibition in place in the previous 2008 FIFA Players Agents regulation. So just to make it clear, agents and intermediaries are essentially forbidden from holding, let's say, economic rights or percentage of players' transfers even before the TPO ban. That, notwithstanding the fact that they were effectively those who most of the times were holding them, and many times even declaring it, for example, to the press, especially in Brazil or South America, the agents would go, would publicly declare, yes, the player is mine, I own the player, I own 30% of the player. And that is one of the reasons why, at the end of the day, a sort of negative, so to say, image happen to surround the practice. So it is important to keep in mind that agents and intermediaries are those who are most, let's say, prohibited from holding these percentages, even if most of the times they are those linked to the TPO owners, because as we know, it is in a certain sense unlikely that the TPO owners invests in the shares of the football player without any link whatsoever to the agent of the player. So this is the answer, let's say, from a regulatory perspective. And again, under a civil law point of view, the answer is kind of similar to the previous one in respect to the further assignment by players of economic rights. And it might be that the agreement is valid under a civil law point of view. We all know what is the nature of the FIFA regulations. They are not a law. They are the regulations issued by a private association under Swiss law. So for example, in some countries, the FIFA regulations on working on intermediaries are even inapplicable. This is the case, for example, of France, because in France, you have a specific law, the Code du Sport, which is mandatory under French law, and which for example, provides for the obtainance of a license, provides for a 10% maximum commission payable to the agent. So in France, you need to have a license to be an agent. So in France, essentially, the French Federation declared the FIFA regulation on working with intermediaries almost tout court inapplicable. So you see that not always this prohibition will be applicable. And also in Germany, there was a decision by the Bundesgericht, so an ordinary court, which had suspended part of the applicability of the FIFA intermediary regulations because against German law. So again, the answer depends on the perspective. It could be that under a civil law point of view, the assignment to the agent could even be valid.
Thank you, Stefano. I think it's an appropriate time to bring in a question for both Daniel and Stefano regarding, it's a question from actually an ISDE alumni, Osvaldo Neto, and he questions, what do you think about regulating TPO as a way of fast financial recovery to clubs in this time of pandemic? And yeah, and if so, if a regulation, a temporary regulation could be in place, if there should be a cap to the third-party ownership on a player's right. So please, first Stefano and then Daniel.
Okay, so, well, there are a number of things to say in this respect. The first is that besides the fact that, of course, we are going through a period of time where liquidity is needed and is missing, and thus TPO has been, in a certain sense, invoked, we also have to think that per se, the times have already changed in respect of 2014. It's only 6 years, but we know that in modern times, and especially in football law, things run very fast. So today, we are not at all in the same situation as 2014. Nowadays, a situation like the one that Daniel mentioned of Tevez and Serrano would simply be impossible. Why? Because we have a lot of tools, a lot of things happen in the meantime in these years, and a lot of things that were implemented by FIFA. So the TMS, for example, one of the main issues for third-party ownership is transparency, is the origin of the money. And thus now we have FIFA, which have implemented a worldwide electronic system to control player transfers, which is almost automatic, the TMS. And also it's about to implement the clearinghouse at the worldwide level. So we have a lot of control nowadays. 10 years ago, we had no control whatsoever on these aspects. So, and one important aspect that I want to underline is that something that really exemplifies all of this is that before the reform of 2014, there was no single case where a club was sanctioned for a violation of 18 bis. So between 2009 and 2014, 18 bis was in place, but there was no sanction at all for a violation for an undue influence, whereas we all know there was even more undue influence than today. Well, since then, and because TMS was introduced and because clubs are now obliged to upload contracts in TMS, we know that sanctions for 18 bis are a current thing, maybe even excessive in a certain sense, but this is another topic which we would have to discuss. And I would also like to say, and then I will leave the floor to Daniel, that as a matter of fact, a proposal has already been presented for a temporary return of the TPO. Our office has been presenting and preparing a document which was already presented to FIFA and to CONMEBOL for a temporary return of TPO until July 2022, also in order to help clubs to face the difficulties posed by pandemic. And what would be the aspect, the aspect, let's say, needed in order to make sure that that regulation would be feasible? And what we have proposed? So a mandatory registration of investors, so a sort of license, as it is happening for agents. You need to satisfy certain requirements in order to be admitted to the market of investors. Mandatory registration of the contracts, so all TPO contracts must be disclosed, and thus linked with this transparency. So both clubs as well as national associations should publish on their websites the exact percentages for each players. Payments would be done using the clearinghouse already set in place by FIFA. Then another very important aspect is standard contracts. So we avoid the risk of those abusive contracts, which were even subject of the Doyen and Sporting cases. So the Leoning, so to say, contracts. So standard contracts, just investment against percentages, mandatory consent of the player. So the player would have to give his consent. Then another thing would be that clubs may only assign economic rights in exchange of a payment, because another issue was that many times, a club would assign the TPO share to agents just because a player was brought there. So essentially the club was losing 30 or 40% of a player, not in exchange of money, but in exchange of a service. So that would be forbidden only for payment. Only clubs could trade the economic rights and not the players. Prohibition for minors also limits, as the question was saying. So prohibition for minors, a maximum of 30% of the share of economic rights would be assigned. So the club would always maintain, say, the majority of the economic rights of the players. And then maximum, and in the same way that FIFA is introducing for loans, a maximum of number of players for clubs. So for example, 5 players maximum for each club, and a maximum of 3 players for each investor, similar to what FIFA is doing now for loans. And then at the end of the day, and also to foster, let's say, investment solidarity and investment into grassroots football, our idea would also to have a sort of solidarity mechanism. So 10% of the TPO revenue would be assigned to solidarity mechanism, effectively to clubs, and also to the FIFA fund, which has been set in place now by FIFA and FIFPro in order to help players victim of bankruptcy. So we have tried to provide a framework, which of course can be improved, but that could address, let's say, all of the main issues of TPO.
If I can maybe just ask then, that's a very interesting development that I hadn't been aware of. So Stefano, it's very interesting that you mentioned that now. The one query that I always have, and I'm sorry guys, I hope you don't mind if I ask a question directly, which is, a lot of the rationale, I think, for why third-party investors will effectively invest for a particular percentage future stake in a player is because, and the mechanism that was previously in place that you talked about, some type of control, was that do you envisage third-party investors would, without that type of mechanism, consider the risk of investing where there must be a distinct likelihood that the team is not incentivized to sell the player at some point? So is there a market for those third-party investors? Because the risk effectively is that the club can just simply take the money and run and never transfer the player.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So what I believe is that the great problem of TPO, how it was structured, was exactly the absence of any risk. So precisely the absence of any risk. If you take those contracts, the Doyen Sporting contract for Rojo, there was no risk whatsoever for Doyen because it was entering into a contract, with a well-established club. And the worst case scenario, since there were, those clauses of minimum return, several options, put up options, so several options in favor of the investor, was that there would be no risk of investment no risk of loss for the investor. And in my opinion, in that moment, you lose the essence of investment. So there must be a risk. And the fact that, coming to the question, the fact that it might be, let's say, less clearly beneficial for investors, I think that it is still a rather lucrative market. I mean, they would still have very good margins if they do their investments wisely. So I would say that it would still be a market which can have a significant return. Let's say a European investor, an English investor, which goes to a market like Africa, where local clubs, or Brazil, where local clubs might really be in need of immediate funding, to set up an academy, for example, in Africa, to foster the development of young players, to help those young players. Then is there a risk? Well, I personally want there to be a risk, but there might still be a very high profit. And then I also think that part of these regulations would, in a sense, for example, the fact of putting limits to the TPO share, so as an example, 30%, I also think that is important. And also, we never advised investors to hold more than 50% or more than 30%, because then at the end of the day, the club will say, well, you know what, unless they have some of those clauses which forces them to sell. But if the investors hold it too much, the percentage, then it is not interesting for the club to sell. So I think that having a reasonable percentage would also maintain the club's interest to, at the end of the day, transfer the player.
And just very briefly, lastly, is that submission being made to particular national associations or to confederations or to FIFA in general?
The proposal? Yeah, we have sent it to CBF, who sent it to CONMEBOL and FIFA.
Okay, interesting.
So Daniel, now we have seen that we know now which is the Stefano's position about TPO and about the regulation versus prohibition. And now I'm very curious to know which is your position. What do you think about it? TPO should be regulated or prohibited? What is your opinion about it?
My personal view has been that to regulate TPO, TPI would have been very resource intensive for any regulator to do. And that is why, among other reasons, why I think there has been less of an appetite to do that in the past. Now, I know there were very sensible recommendations and provisions put forward, exactly as Stefano mentioned, back in 2013-14 as to the regulation rather than the prohibition. I actually think in this economic time now, where a number of clubs and leagues and associations and confederations are in significant financial, in the face of particular severe financial harm, being able to raise money in innovative ways may actually save clubs. So when we're talking about the times to be able to find solutions, if it's loans, if it's advancing of TV monies, if it's advancement of transfer revenues, if it's being able to find novel ways to be able to commercialize particular rights. My own view is that although it will be a very resource intensive process, if there is capital there to be invested based on the risk that Stefano very articulately explained, my view is it is absolutely something that needs to be investigated further. I, like a lot of people, wasn't necessarily convinced by all of the arguments raised as to why a prohibition should be, but at the same time, there were a number of abusive situations. And ultimately, the midway point is exactly as Stefano's mentioned, which is a highly regulated, controlled system with standard contracts, complete transparency, limits on the number of investments and particular percentage investments. And that, I think, in a lot of ways alleviates particular systemic risk. Now, the realist in me says I still think it would be very difficult for change to necessarily happen in the short term, but a systemic event like we have seen with COVID and the economic consequences of such a situation has to invoke the authorities to think of ideas outside of the box, and this, my view is, should certainly be one consideration.
Stefano, do you have something to add?
Well, I think that there are two aspects also that might be added to the discussion. One is that one of the arguments that were historically raised against TPO, and that is also raised in a sense again in favor of limiting agents' commission, because at the end of the day, the two topics are linked. We cannot speak about, essentially, we cannot speak about TPO without speaking about agents. And is the argument that TPO should forbidden because it brings money out of the football family? And that for me, when I hear this, I really wonder myself, but where does most of the money in football go? We all know the answer, like 70% of clubs' budgets go to football players. But I'm not talking about grassroots. I'm not talking about the youth categories. I'm talking about the millionaire players. So why are we saying that the money that is paid, let's say, to the TPO investors goes out of football family, and a very, very high salary to a football player remain within the football family? Effectively, how does this player spend his money, or how does a coach or an executive of a club spend his money? Because we have experience with the players, they do not reinvest it into football. They do not reinvest it into football. This is the reality. It is more likely, in my opinion, that a TPO investor would reinvest the money into football, maybe because it was lucrative for them. And then he might take, of course, he's going to take a share out of the football family. I'm not going to nobody can have any doubt on that. But in my opinion, it is more likely that a TPO investor would reinvest part of the money than a football player. So this argument, in my opinion, is a bit hypocritical. So to say that money that goes to investors goes out of football family, and that money that goes to footballers is widely spent. And the other aspect is that I think that prohibition fails. And again, I'm not here saying that everything about TPO is marvelous. There is no black and white. And as a matter of fact, a number of TPO transactions brought very bad consequences for football, and the situation as it was is unacceptable. But having contact in the practice with agents or with TPO investors, and especially those who work on a low level. So I'm not talking about the great agents. I'm talking about those who work on a low level and that go to search players in markets in third world country, or players that would have no opportunity whatsoever. If you limit, it's maybe hard to explain this to football regulators, let's say, but if you limit cap, if you put a cap on commissions, or if you prohibit TPO, what you are effectively doing is making it impossible for any investor or football agent to go to markets such as Africa, for example, and bring a player to Europe, because the figures are too low. So an agent who goes, for instance, to Africa, I recently met a client of mine, a very young and serious person, and he's working with Africa, and he says the players, they come to Europe to second or third division clubs, and they earn a minimum salary. They earn 1,000 euro, which for them is good money, gives them an opportunity. They make the first step to Europe. But for the agent, if the agent only earns 3% of that, what is he's gonna do is he's gonna be unable to do that. He's gonna be unable to sustain the expenses, because football clubs, they do not have the structures, for example, to go to Africa and scout. So what they do is they rely on those kind of people who have knowledge of the local markets. But those people need to have a sustainable business model, and it is not sustainable for them to only earn 3% of the player's salary, without counting the fact that the excess of prohibition many times leads only to circumvention. So, and with that, we could open another big door for discussions.
Daniel?
No, I don't have too much to add there. I definitely agree that what there sometimes can be confusion on as well is, with a lot of the work that I do with agents, is where, for example, a percentage of a transfer fee, if an agent is acting for a selling club, becomes a percentage of a future transfer fee. And that sometimes can be the difficult issue for regulators, for contracts, for clubs to actually deal with, which is under the FIFA proposals for the commission cap, it is possible for an agent acting for the selling club to be earning 10% of the transfer fee if he or she is brokering that deal. Now, a lot of people would still argue that that is not a future transfer fee, but to a degree, it is a future transfer fee. It is just couched in a slightly different way of an agreement when an agent is not acting for a player. But if an agent is acting for a player, there is a much more difficult area to try and explain how then that agent can earn as a percentage of a transfer fee when he or she will only be earning presumably a percentage of the player's gross salary. And that's where things can get a little bit tricky by way of the regulations and by way of agreements between clubs and agents regarding remuneration and then regarding potential breaches of the TPI regulations.
Thank you, Daniel. Andre, we are coming to the end of our conversation. Do you have like a final consideration?
I would like to thank the speakers, thank ISDE for giving us this platform to have such interesting discussions. The topic raises a lot of questions and doubts, and I am glad we are able to address most of them, but there's always room for more, and we'll have other discussions on the subject for sure. And thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Daniel Geey, for taking the time to speak to us. Thank you, Stefano, for finding this window within your schedule. You're two great speakers, very influential on the subject, and it's a pleasure for us to have you both here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and thanks for that opportunity to speak with Stefano. I learned an awful lot as well today, which was good.
I make Daniel's words mine, so I thank Lucio and Andrea for the invitation, and it was really a pleasure to share the stage with Daniel.
Thank you all guys. I tried to take notes on everything you said, and especially when I listened to the proposal that Stefano and this law firm did to CBF, and then CBF forwarded to FIFA. So I look forward to know more about this proposal. I think it could be very, very interesting and like a good new tool for especially for South American and African football clubs. That said, thanks to all of you. Can't wait to meet all of you in person as the pandemic ends, and we will talk more about this topic and many more, hopefully very, very soon. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Nice evening. Bye-bye.